The book of Genesis is one of the most historically significant, scientifically insightful, and theologically revealing books in the entire Bible. It begins with creation 6,000 years ago and then takes us on a dramatic journey through the first 2,300 years of human history. Genesis is told in two parts, chapters 1 to 11, which cover the creation of man, the fall of humanity, and the devastating effects of sin, and chapters 12 to 50, which narrate God's plan to redeem us to himself through the faithful descendants of one man and his family, Abraham. Join me as we take a journey through this fascinating narrative from God's Word, the Holy Bible. Part 1, Genesis 1 to 11. Chapters 1 and 2 describe how God created the heavens and the earth out of nothing in 6 days. On the first day he created a divine light separating day from night. On the second, the sky to divide the waters above from the waters below. On the third, he gathered the waters into seas so that dry land appeared and created vegetation. On the fourth, he created the sun, moon, and stars. On the fifth, sea creatures and birds. And on the sixth day, land animals. And finally, his most beloved creations of all, Adam and Eve, created in his own image. God commanded them to be fruitful and multiply, and to tend to and care for the creation. In the midst of the garden stood the tree of life, along with a life-sustaining river and food in abundance. There was also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, from which God forbade them to eat, lest they experience death. In chapter 3, Adam and Eve yield to Satan's temptation to disobey by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God then expels them from the garden, and they are permanently separated from the tree of life and his immediate presence. But God did not leave them without hope, foretelling the eventual coming of the Messiah, who would crush Satan's power under his feet and bring salvation to their offspring. From that pivotal moment, humanity became inherently sinful. Life became laborious, human relations fractured, and the creation was corrupted. In chapter 4, sinful and proud Cain murdered his innocent brother Abel, a foreshadowing of the future where the wicked would slay the righteous. This period saw men begin to gather into community groups with advancements in arts, agriculture, and manufacturing. By chapter 5, some people began to call upon the name of the Lord, but most descended into depravity, violence, and chaos. Chapter 6 reveals the appearance of mysterious beings thought by many to be fallen angels who interbred with human women. Their offspring, the Nephilim, were mighty giants described as men of renown, and their presence is associated with the spread of corruption and depravity that led to God's judgment through the flood. The remainder of chapter 6, along with chapters 7 through to 9, tells the story of Noah's Ark and the flood. Seeing the world filled with violence, God destroyed the evildoers by bursting open the fountains of the deep and opening the floodgates of the heavens. Only righteous Noah and his family of 8 were saved. In chapter 10, Noah's descendants begin to repopulate the earth, but despite the removal of the wicked during the flood, humanity quickly reverted back to doing evil. In chapter 11, united in culture and a common language, the people banded together to build the Tower of Babel, a monstrous monument to their pride and arrogance in wanting to reach the heavens and make a name for themselves without God. But God confused their language and scattered them to the 4 corners of the earth, leaving the tower unfinished. If anything, the flood and the Tower of Babel events showed that punishment alone could not save humanity. What was really needed was a renewal of the heart, which only a Savior could accomplish. Part 2, Genesis 12 to 50. In chapter 12, God moves on to the next step of his redemptive plan. He calls upon Abram, later known as Abraham, to father a new nation of faithful people who would convey his messages to humanity and pave the way for the coming Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Abram, who was living in Haran, was tasked with leaving his country behind and journeying to a land that God pledged to give to his descendants, who he promised would be as innumerable as the stars in the heavens. It was a monumental mission. The promised land, known as Canaan, was far away and inhabited by powerful and wicked tribes. Yet, Abram believed and obeyed God, thus beginning a tremendous odyssey for him and his descendants that spanned hundreds of years. A journey of faith marked by grueling travels, unexpected twists and turns, debilitating trials, epic failures and euphoric triumphs. So Abram took his wife Sarai, who was also his half-sister and was later known as Sarah, and his nephew Lot, and embarked on the 900 kilometers journey to Canaan, only to be forced by a famine to sojourn in Egypt for a while. In Egypt, afraid of being killed for his beautiful wife, Abram partially deceives Pharaoh by claiming Sarai was his sister, but not disclosing that she was also his wife. So Pharaoh took her into his palace, believing she was unmarried. But God intervened, and Pharaoh sent them away laden with wealth, which they took back to Canaan. In chapter 13, Abram and Lot agreed to settle in separate parts of Canaan. It was there that God reaffirmed his pledge to give the land to Abram's descendants forever, adding that he would cause them to grow in number until they were virtually uncountable. Chapter 14 sees Abram and his men rescue Lot and his family from captivity by a coalition of 4 kings who battled with the king of Sodom and Gomorrah. A mysterious figure then appears, Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of the one true God, blesses Abram, who in turn gives him a tithe. Many theologians believe Melchizedek served as a type or foreshadowing of Christ. In chapter 15, God makes a covenant with childless Abram, promising him a child as his heir and reaffirming his promise to give the land to his descendants. God seals the covenant with a solemn ritual, also revealing that they will endure 400 years of captivity in Egypt before possessing the land. In chapter 16, still barren and doubting God's promise, Sarai suggests that Abram have a child with her maidservant Hagar. After Hagar conceives, she begins to look down on Sarai. In response, Sarai deals harshly with her, and Hagar flees to the wilderness where she's visited by the angel of the Lord. He tells her to return to Abram and Sarai and assures her that she will have numerous descendants through her son Ishmael. By chapter 17, Abram is 99 years old and Sarai is 89. God appears to Abram again and changes their names to Abraham and Sarah, and he once again reaffirms his covenant with Abraham. In chapter 18, the Lord visits Abraham and tells him that Sarah will have a child within a year. Sarah overhears the conversation from within the tent and laughs in disbelief, for which the Lord chides her. The Lord also reveals his plan to destroy the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham intercedes, pleading for the cities to be spared if a certain number of righteous people are found, and the Lord agrees. In chapter 19, 2 angels carry out God's instructions to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah with fire and brimstone. Only Lot and his family are saved. As they flee, Lot's wife disobeys the angels' instructions to not look back and is turned into a pillar of salt. In chapter 20, Abraham and Sarah journey to Gerar, where Abraham again claims his wife Sarah is his sister. King Abimelech takes Sarah for himself, but God intervenes again. Abimelech returns Sarah, rebukes Abraham for his deception, and sends them away with livestock and servants. Sarah gives birth to Isaac in chapter 21, fulfilling God's promise. When Isaac is weaned, teenage Ishmael mocks him, and Abraham reluctantly sends Ishmael and his mother away at the urging of Sarah. They wander in the wilderness, but God provides for them and promises Hagar that Ishmael will become a great nation. In an event foreshadowing the sacrifice of Christ, the Lamb of God, God tests Abraham in chapter 22, commanding him to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham obeys, but an angel intervenes at the last minute, providing a ram instead. God reaffirms his covenant and blesses Abraham for his faithfulness. In chapter 23, Sarah dies at 127 years old. Abraham lays her to rest in a burial cave. In chapter 24, Abraham sends a servant to his homeland to find a wife for Isaac. Supernaturally guided by God, the servant meets Rebekah, a relative of Isaac, at a well. She agrees to marry Isaac, returns with the servant, and Isaac and Rebekah become husband and wife. Abraham dies in chapter 25 at 175 years old and is buried beside Sarah. Rebekah gives birth to twins, Esau and Jacob. When they grow up, Esau carelessly sells his treasured birthright to Jacob in exchange for a meal of bread and lentil stew. This decision contributes to Jacob being chosen to carry on the messianic line and marks the beginning of a decades-long tumultuous relationship between the two, characterized by rivalry and deception, but ending in eventual reconciliation. In chapter 26, Isaac faces famine and escapes to Gerar, where he repeats Abraham's deception by calling his beautiful wife Rebekah his sister. Despite this, God blesses Isaac with wealth and numerous wells. In chapter 27, Jacob deceives his father Isaac and receives from him the important blessing intended for his brother Esau. Enraged, Esau vows to kill Jacob, so their mother Rebekah advises Jacob to flee to her brother Laban back in Haran. In chapter 28, before leaving Canaan, Jacob receives instruction from Isaac to find a wife in Haran. While on his journey, Jacob dreams of a ladder reaching to heaven with angels ascending and descending on it. The Lord himself reaffirms with Jacob his covenant with Abraham. The experience is transformative, and Jacob vows to make the Lord his God and to give 10% of whatever God provides back to him. In chapters 29 to 31, Jacob meets his future wife Rachel at a well and agrees to work for her father, his uncle Laban, for 7 years to marry her. But Laban deceives him and instead ushers in her older sister Leah on the wedding night. Jacob works another 7 years for Rachel and another 6 for the flocks. After years of disagreements and mistreatment by Laban, Jacob leaves with his wives and children to return to Canaan, ending his 20-year sojourn in Haran. In chapter 32, on his journey back to Canaan, Jacob experiences another transformative event. A heavenly being visits him, and they engage in an all-night wrestling match. The being dislocates Jacob's hip and the fight ends, but not before Jacob pleads for a blessing, which the spiritual being grants him. He also instructs Jacob to change his name from Jacob, meaning deceiver, to Israel, meaning one who struggles with God, or God prevails. But we'll continue to call him Jacob here for simplicity's sake. In chapter 33, Jacob makes it back to Canaan, where he meets his brother Esau. In a highly emotional reunion, Esau surprisingly embraces Jacob with forgiveness. Chapter 34 tells a disturbing story. Jacob had settled among one of the Canaanite tribes, where the prince of the tribe violates his daughter Dinah. Her brothers Simeon and Levi are outraged and execute a successful plot to slaughter all the tribesmen, after which their brothers plunder the town. Jacob rebuked his sons for the vengeful act. In chapter 35, God appears to Jacob twice, blessing him and reaffirming his covenant to Abraham. Sadly, his beloved wife Rachel dies while giving birth to his youngest son Benjamin. His father Isaac also dies at 180 years old, and Jacob and his brother Esau bury him. Chapter 36 lists the descendants of Jacob's brother Esau, highlighting the separation of their lineages, the fulfilling of God's plan for Israel, and the consequences of Esau missing out on his inheritance. By chapter 37, Jacob has 12 sons by his wives, Leah and Rachel, and their servants, Zilpah and Bilhah. The 12 include Judah, through whom the Messiah would eventually come. The brothers would become the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel, which were established upon the eventual conquest of the Promised Land 400 years later. The relationships between the 12 their mothers and their father Jacob, were complex and tumultuous. But the Genesis narrative now shifts to focus on the second youngest son, Joseph, who would play a pivotal role in the survival of this family, crucial to God's redemptive plan. Joseph was Jacob's favored son, to whom he gave a beautiful colored garment as a sign of his affection for him. While in his late teens, Joseph reported his older brothers' evil behavior to their father and has dreams indicating future honor and authority over his family. His jealous and enraged brothers then sell him to slave traders, faking his death to their father. Jacob mourns deeply, believing Joseph is dead. Joseph winds up in Egypt, sold to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. In chapter 38, back in Canaan, Joseph's brother Judah's widowed daughter-in-law Tamar disguises herself as a harlot in order to trick him into impregnating her. As a result, she bore twins, continuing Judah's lineage through whom the Messiah would come. Chapter 39 tells us how Joseph prospered in Egypt due to his faith and diligence, earning promotion to chief steward of Potiphar's house, until Potiphar's wife falsely accuses him of forcing himself on her, causing him to be imprisoned. But his good character earns him God's blessing and protection, as well as favor with the warden, who puts him in charge of the other prisoners. In chapter 40, while still imprisoned, Joseph correctly interprets the dreams of fellow prisoners, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, correctly predicting that the cupbearer would be freed and reinstated to his position, and that the baker would be hanged. 2 years later, in chapter 41, Pharaoh has two troubling dreams, and the previously restored cupbearer recommends Joseph be called to interpret them. Trusting God for wisdom, Joseph interprets the dreams as 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, and suggests Pharaoh appoint a trusted official to oversee preparation for the famine. Impressed, Pharaoh appoints Joseph to the job, declaring, "Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is?" The famine hits the region hard, but Egypt is prepared with the food supplies Joseph had stored away during the 7 plenteous years. Meanwhile, his family back in Canaan suffers, and in chapter 42, Jacob sends his sons down to Egypt to buy grain, where they unknowingly meet the brother they had sold into slavery. Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. He saves them from starvation by selling them grain, but not before initiating a carefully devised long-term plan to test whether they had repented of the evil they had done to him over 20 years ago. Throughout the chapter and continuing through to chapter 45, he accuses them of spying and theft. He holds one of them, Simeon, hostage in prison, and finally threatens to enslave the youngest brother Benjamin. Judah, knowing that losing Benjamin, on top of his beloved Rachel's death, and Joseph's perceived death, would likely cause their father to die of grief, sacrificially offers himself to be enslaved in Benjamin's place. Convinced of his brother's inner change, in a highly emotional scene, Joseph reveals his identity to them and forgives them for selling him into slavery. He explains God's plan to save their family through him and invites his whole family to live in Egypt during the remaining years of famine. In chapter 46, Jacob leaves Canaan with his extended family, cattle and possessions, and travels to Egypt. After 20 long and trying years, Joseph and his father are tearfully reunited. Chapter 47 sees Joseph present his father to Pharaoh, who receives Jacob's blessing and allows him to settle in the fertile region of Goshen, where he and his family prosper and multiply greatly after the famine ends. Joseph manages the famine wisely, and the Egyptian people avoid starvation, although at the cost of relinquishing their land to Pharaoh. By chapter 48, Jacob is old and ill and nearing the end of his life. He blesses Joseph's 2 young sons, and ignoring tradition and Joseph's protests, he intentionally gives the primary blessing to the younger son, Ephraim. The descendants of both eventually form 2 of the 12 tribes of the Promised Land, with Ephraim's tribe having greater prominence than Manasseh's. In chapter 49, Jacob gathers his sons one last time to bless and prophesy over each one, and reveals their future tribes' destinies. Judah receives the preeminent blessing, and Jacob foretells that the Messiah shall come through Judah's tribe. Jacob instructs his sons to bury him in the cave of Machpelah in Canaan, and then dies. In chapter 50, the final chapter of this epic narrative, Joseph mourns Jacob's death, and he and his brothers bury him in Canaan. Afterward, his brothers fear that now that their father is dead, Joseph will exact revenge on them for the evil they had done to him. But Joseph forgives and reassures them, emphasizing God's plan to turn their evil into good. Joseph dies in Egypt at 110 years old. However, before his death, he requests that his bones be carried up from Egypt and buried in Canaan. And it is in Canaan, the promised land, where the descendants of he and his great-grandfather Abraham would 400 years later eventually settle and fulfill their destiny to be the faithful people of God. Through them, God would bless the world with the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who would die on the cross for the sins of the world that entered humanity through the disobedience of Adam and Eve.